We have just requested for the AV support, so somebody's coming in. Just hold on.
Did you try to unplug
Yeah,
HDMI
I did.
as well?
Yes. But nothing happened.
No, no. So when you connect, it tries to sort of reset, cycle through, but it has no effect. High speed.
No, that was. I mean, was it sitting in the wall there?
Yes.
It was like this.
No, it was like this, and one was the. Excuse me?
Oh, that's technology, sorry.
Yeah.
So we were presenting in the room across the road last week, and we found that it needs power. So if you unplug it from the wall and plug it back in, because it's directly.
No, this is the one.
Yep.
Yep, it just turned on.
So these don't have enough power to activate the projector.
I see.
So by plugging it directly into my laptop,
Okay. And now I can.
now you can.
Excellent. Thank you.
Oh gosh, thank you so much. It will stay on for like. It. Can you just give me one?
I've got another HDMI adapter that's Type-C that might work.
It's not coming up. Oh. Bloody Apple. It's a.
You don't have enough power coming out of it.
Oh yes, something is coming. Coming. Hey, yay! Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I owe you a drink. Has the more power than this one.
Oh.
Yes.
I didn't know.
You can charge another laptop from this one.
Okay.
Yes.
Maybe we should.
No. Just don't touch it. Don't
No,
touch it.
no,
Just
no.
don't touch it. Yes, starting now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here. This is Routing Security BOF. Those who have been coming to Apricot and APNIC meetings, I've been doing this thing for last 7 events. Yes, I'm not getting bored out of it. But this time, every time we make sure that we have a focus on few things. This time we have a focus on very, very new thing, which we're going to talk about today, later on. And that is RPKI. I hope you haven't heard about it before. So we'll talk about it. Let's explore how things working and what's new and how to address few things. So just before starting that, my colleague is going to give you a quick overview of the Manners Observatory and give you some highlights about it, that what we are doing in terms of gathering data and showing how things are working on the routing table. So, Andre, just.
Thanks. Thank you, Aftab. So yeah, this is sort of to set the stage, because there will be a lot of talks about technology, but also to highlight that we really need concerted action. So it's not only technology, it's also a social, economic problem. So we know that BGP is insecure. I think there were already presentations at this meeting that highlighted this fact. And insecure in a way that using BGP doesn't have intrinsic mechanism to validate the information you're getting from your neighbors, right? So you have to trust them, or you have to resort to other data sources to check that. So data is very important if you want to build a secure routing system. What's also important is that there must be incentive for operators to use this sort of tools and data and resort to those data sources. So those three things, and that's where the overlap is, and that's what we are working to increase, I think, we as the community, and that's to produce an action. So look at this from a slightly different perspective. We are all in this together. You can look at this and say, hey, security, routing security of my own network is in the hands of other network operators, right? You can do only so much to protect your own network, but other operators have to either validate or, well, they have to validate to protect your own network. So that seems like a strange sort of displacement of incentives, right? Someone else has to protect your own network. And that is sort of known as a, well, sometimes it's called strategy of the common, sometimes it's a collective action problem. It's really a social problem that we're trying to solve here. One of the things that sort of suggested how to solve that problem is regulation, but it's probably not going to work on a global scale. It's a very sort of slow process if we attempt to achieve it. But one of the things that sort of humanity tried to, well, found useful is to create norms. So mutually agreed norms for routing security attempts to do this stuff. So it creates a baseline dividing good from bad, acceptable behavior in routing operations from unacceptable. And this is a very simple baseline distilled from best current practices and other operational practices that operators are using. And another thing that's very important is that you achieve visibility. You actually know that those practices are widely used. And for this, you need to build a visible community. And Manners is, that's another facet of Manners, is to build and demonstrate that there is community behind those norms, that those norms are not just paperwork and slideware, but real operational practices. So a quick overview of those norms for Manners for internet service providers. There are 4 norms, pretty much, I think, undisputed, right? But they're tightly scoped. They're tightly scoped for low cost and low risk. It's basically, what they tell you is clean up your side of the street and expect others to do the same, so there is certain reciprocity. When we start Manners in 2014, end of 2014, and when I say we, it was 9 network operators that started the whole thing. After some time, we realized that we need other partners to speed it up and scale this up. And one of the important partners that came to mind was Internet Exchange Points. The thing is, they have their operational communities, right? Local operational communities with common operation objective. it's in their interest and in the interest of their communities to create safe neighborhoods. So there was sort of very obvious candidates to, shoulder this effort. But they're not IXPs, they're not ISPs. So what happened is that we created a separate set of actions. And when I say we, it's 12 internet exchange points that got together and created a set of actions for themselves. One important action is that many IXPs are using route server to support multilateral peerings. And important action is that route server implements strict filtering of routing announcements it gets from its peers. And when I say strict, it's whitelist filtering. So if a peer hasn't registered their announcements or intentions in one of routing repositories, they will not get through the route server, and therefore you will not be able to peer. Next obvious candidate, which is work in progress, is content. Content providers can have enormous peering power. People want to peer with them. If we can leverage this peering power and impose some sort of, raise the bar a bit higher, I think that can have enormous impact on the security of routing system. So this is manners. But let's look at the problem we're trying to solve. So I used BGP Stream. It's a public service that looks at sort of, BGP changes and makes some assumptions about if it's a legitimate change or an incident. And I looked at this data for 2018, and that's what I found. It was about 1,300 incidents happening on the 13,000, I apologize, incidents happening on the internet, where sort of 40% of them were routing security incidents, route leaks or route hijacks. Almost 5% of all networks were affected globally. About 2,700 networks fell a victim of a routing incident, and almost 1,300 caused this incident globally. Now, there's some caveats. I mean, data about routing system without knowing the intent, you can make mistakes. You can have false positives, or you can also miss some of the incidents happening, right, because you have limited view. But what is important, if you apply the same methodology again and again, you take sort of, you can draw a line and you can see how the system evolves. So I didn't draw a line. I had only 2 points because I did this experiment in 2017 and then repeated it last year. So, but again, what is the dynamics from this comparison? I think we did better in 2018 than in 2017. You can see almost 17% decrease in sort of number of culprits, almost 10% decrease in number of incidents, and about 12% decrease in number of affected networks. Interestingly enough, the sort of ratio between incidents and outages remained pretty much the same. So it's 2 years review, right? If we look at the dynamics for some of the sort of countries with top number of potential victims, and this is the percentage of networks that were affected in the country and percentage of networks operating in that country. Again, you can see a pretty good and positive dynamics. Maybe, Bangladesh, an exception for other countries, and mainly in China is also, we see some slight increase, but other countries, they managed to decrease affected networks significantly. Now let's look at the sort of culprits, the networks that caused this incident. And again, we see, except mainland China, we see for some countries very significant decrease in number of networks that caused incident in a country. So interesting data, 2 data points do not demonstrate the trend. It may be just one-off. But can we track those things long time? Because we talk about routing security in terms of like specific incidents. We dive deep and explore, which is very important, interesting data, but how the whole system is evolving. I mean, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Efforts like Manus or other efforts have impact on the security of routing system. That would be very interesting to know. So we launched this project, which we call Manus Observatory and Member Reports. It has twofold. twofold objective. One is to track and present this kind of global trend in routing system. Another one is to make the MANAS effort itself more transparent, bring to the attention of the members if they have any shortcomings with regards to their MANAS readiness. And also ultimately, eventually, to bring this to the public and see how networks that committed to MANAS, committed to routing security, how they sort of stand against those commitments. So observatory is it's still in development. We haven't launched that publicly yet, but I'll show you some screenshots just to give you an idea what we're talking about. So that's state of routing security. It will allow you to have a look at a particular time period. In this particular case, this is real data. This is not a mock-up. For January 2019, APNIC region, you can see state of routing security in terms of incidents, in terms of culprits, in terms of completeness of routing information, routing registries, and RPKI. But also you can see for all networks, not only MANAS members, but you can see for all networks sort of level of their MANAS readiness. So it's tailored to MANAS and also MANAS actions, of course. And you can see, well, for instance, right, like RPKI completeness, only 5%, and 90% completeness of routing registry, which is, I think, not a bad outcome. Now, you can also track. We only start collecting data in September last year, but you can look how a system evolves. And the more data the observatory collects, the more interesting trends you can see. And you can play with this visual interface and select different things and make your own conclusions. You can also compare things, for instance, on regional level. And in this particular case, you can compare how the state of routing security in Brightpens Sea service region versus state of routing security in APNIC region. Or you can compare on the country level, right? You can compare how Belgium stands against Netherlands, for instance. And while those sort of cryptic, a little bit cryptic spider charts, they basically indicate all the metrics we're using to sort of produce the state of routing security. And the bigger the footprint, the better the state of routing security. So let me finish my presentation with sort of, summary. Why should operators consider joining MANAS? Well, if your network doesn't implement those controls and is not sort of meeting the requirements outlined in MANAS, I think it's good time to think about that. And that will allow you also to achieve some benefits, making your own network also more secure, enable your sort of security processes in your network at quite sort of low cost. If you are implementing this stuff, joining MANAS is a way to demonstrate that those practices that you are deploying or employing, they are reality. They are not just paperwork. And in general, I mean, as you join the community of security-minded operators, I think that opens new opportunities for collaboration in the space. And although MANAS is not there yet, but I think people more and more recognize MANAS as not as a quality mark yet, but in the future can be used as a differentiator when you offer certain services or you engage in peering relationships. So finally, let me show you how development of the initiative. As I said, we started with 9 operators in 2014, and now we are more than 130 operators covering more than 250 ISNs. So pretty good uptake. Hope will continue as that. With that, I think, yeah, I hope I set some scene for the distinguished panel. So the final message that routing security can be solved only together. Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Andre. And I just realized we have 2 mics. Yes. So just I want to keep it this way. This one. The biggest problem I see in this chart for the Asia Pacific, and I'm pretty sure this is same and similar for the all other regions, is the last circle, which is the global validation of RPKI. And we've been hearing about this for quite some time, and I think I have 4 to 5 T-shirts saying ROA on it, and because I take it every year, and but still 4 to 5%. So there's something wrong, right? So something is missing. Why the adoption rate is still pretty low? So what happened last 2 weeks ago? Someone pretty senior, very senior in our industry, decided to have a roundtable in San Francisco just before NANOG on the RPKI, topic of RPKI, and said, okay, fine, let's, yeah, senior, AKA old. And it triggered something, saying, okay, fine, like-minded people sit together, decide what's happening, how we can improve it, how we can make it better. So that's why I said, guys, come over here in the Asia Pacific region, sit again without the table, but in a round shape, and discuss the same thing. So I would like to invite Job, Mark, and Martin. No. Sit. You cannot stand for that long. It's not a recorded session, I hope, so it's okay. All right, okay. That's okay. So
We've already told the moderator that we want to do something different than how he's moderating, so this is going to go well.
still it's 1-0 anyway. So I'll start with you, Martin. Why there was a need for a round table? I mean, RPK is going absolutely fine, right? So
Right. So Martin Levy, Cloudflare, was a long-time operator of networks, now spend more time pontificating about networks. And you're absolutely right. The graphs for sort of general RPKI goodness are going up and to the right. The question is, are they going up and the right quick enough? And are they going up to the right and sort of ignoring certain issues? And what happened was that Job, myself, one other person, Doug Montgomery from NIST, National Institute of Science and Technology, I think, Standards and Technology. Standards.
Not science.
Science, standards. Who has been very much involved in monitoring all manner of aspects of security and routing. We sat at a NANOG meeting and sort of said, you know, we should get together and actually discuss this specifically from an operational point of view to try and break the 30-minute talk plus 5 minutes of questions that occur at operational conferences like this and others. Maybe we get a full hour for a BOF, but we wanted a long time, and we wanted to go deep into certain subjects, and we wanted to get other people dragged along as best we could. And this morphed, and it morphed to a full-day event. We ran it the day before NANOG, taking advantage of a lot of people that were in town, and put together a fairly rough, loose schedule to be adjusted sort of on the fly as people were there. And the goal was to get large networks, content players, internet exchanges, members of the community, whether they be from the RIR or other ISTAR entities, and to have a good, solid, strong conversation, hopefully with essentially no time limit, although after 6 hours, I think we were all spent. And yeah, I was. So I would claim, I'm biased, that it was a success. It ended up having discussions from all of the players that both Andre talked about, from backbones, from internet exchanges, from software developers within this arena, and within content players, such as my company. And talked about tools, and had, I think a lot of people walked away with a much clearer understanding of what other people are doing, what issues they've seen, and really did solidify this up and to the right. You know, these numbers are looking better and better. Oh, there are issues. There are some major issues still to be dealt with. But it wasn't, with great respect to the IETF, it wasn't there to be sort of a protocol design environment. It was meant to be literally one operator talking about experience to another. A couple of highlights, if I may. One of the biggest networks there that turned around and said, we are both serious and already implemented in an RPK environment, was AT&T. And AT&T, this is a non-trivial network. It is an access network for a large number of home users, but it also so happens to be a tier 1 backbone. And that, linked in with the action of RPKI finding invalids and dropping invalids. In fact, there is no safety net to that. In the RPKI world, we talk a lot about marking a route valid or invalid. And if it's invalid, we don't use it. Well, if you still have a default route, you're still going to route, right? In a tier 1 network, in a default-free network, that route goes away. So it was great to hear the experiences, the testing that went on to that. From a content point of view, Cloudflare is also dropping invalids at the present moment in time, but we run default routes everywhere, so it has less effect. But we've been out measuring network traffic and contacting players. From the RIR's point of view, we came up with some interesting conversations about the 24/7 requirements that network operators have. And if we start relying on data from an RIR, which we do, we need to project a requirement for 24/7 data.
Yeah, that was the...
But the net point of this is that, sorry, I missed one category which is important. The software developers, for validators and the like, got to talk about what they're doing, because we need tools. None of this stuff is doable without software development. And a subtlety of protocols and software is that you don't want one piece of software, everybody running the same piece of software. You actually need some variance in the world so that you can both validate a protocol that is defined by seeing diverse pieces of software talk to each other or generate the same data. And you also realize that not everybody's environment is the same. Whether it be by software choice, I like language this versus language that, or because you're actually operating in a specific environment and certain languages or certain libraries work better for you. I'll stop talking at this point. Well, you were there, so give an alternate.
And then, so, from the network operator's point of view, right, you've been doing a lot in this arena, and also not just doing it, asking others to do it, and advocating about it. So just your experience, why?
Why what?
RPKI, creating the ROAS, signing your resources, making sure that everything is in line. I mean, you were part of the Manners founding members, and there was on the action 4, everybody kept the global validation. Either you put you create route objects in the IRDB, or you create ROAs, and that was, I mean, very well calculated, because people knew at that time that it's not going to be and. So, at what stage we will be at? We will be comfortable saying, okay, fine, you have to do both. How long it took you as one of the largest service provider in the world?
Let me first go to your question, why RPKI? I spent numerous hours analyzing the environment and what data sources are available to NTT to ensure that we are propagating only routes to and from places where we should be propagating them. And if you look at the landscape, say, 10 years ago, there were 40, 50 IRR databases, each of them managed with different policies, different validation rules, different service level expectations. And then aside from IRR, there were other sources such as WHOIS databases or things that resemble WHOIS but are published on FTP sites. For instance, some of the data published by the Brazilian NIR. And there's no consistency globally. So as a global network, when we approach customers and ask them, can you please somehow tell us your routing intentions, and preferably in a way that is programmatically digestible by our systems, it's a bit challenging. Now with RPKI, for the first time in the internet's history, I think we have a real shot at having a globally consistent, cryptographically verifiable publication mechanism where we can consume data to be used in routing decisions. And that's something I like about RPKI, that it has formal definitions through IETF, whereas specifically WHOIS sources, there is no formal definition. Each of the organizations driving a WHOIS source maybe documented what they did, maybe they didn't. And that's, to me, a very appealing side of RPKI. Then another game changer, and this took me a while to figure out. Originally, I didn't really see a difference between IRR route objects and RPKI ROAS. I thought, both of them have a prefix, both of them have an origin, and what's the difference? And then, and it's almost embarrassing how long it took me, but the RFC that specifies how origin validation is done, 6811, gives a semantic difference between IRR route objects and RPKI ROAS. And I don't know if this is the correct formal term, but one is exclusive and the other is not. With an IRR route object, it only says something about the object itself. That one of the possible things you may see in a BGP table is that combination of a prefix and an origin ASN. But it does not preclude other announcements from existing, because those may be documented in other IRR sources that you may or may not be using. So it's open-ended. And this means that IRR is pretty useful to use on customer-facing sessions, but you cannot use IRR to apply filters on your upstream providers that have the rest of the internet, because we simply don't know where the rest of the internet is documented. With RPKI, however, the semantics of what a ROA means, and that it's a higher source of truth compared to IRR or WHOIS, we can apply reject filters on every type of eBGP session, including transit, including peering, including customer-facing sessions. Because if a ROA exists, it is a statement that any other source of data, such as IRR or WHOIS, that is in conflict with that information, or even a BGP update, can be rejected. And that makes origin validation quite unique compared to traditional filtering based on RPSL or IR sources.
So entity is dropping the invalids?
No.
Any plans of doing that?
Of course.
Okay.
NTT is at the stage where we are figuring out how to get there, and with how I mean what software are we qualifying, what versions will we run, what type of diversity do we want on the validator side, what parameters and knobs do we want to tweak on the routers. We are a large telco. We're moving at a speed that is different than Cloudflare, but we'll get there. I think within a year we'll be in a similar position where AT&T is. Don't, you know, hold me my words against myself.
It's not recorded.
But other interesting developments. So that's origin validation applied to BGP updates on the edge of our network. And what AT&T is doing, NTT will do the same. Another interesting development is that NTT is responsible for the IRRD software. And IRRD is used on RADB, Ccalm, LTB, and other IRR databases. And in a version that we intend to release later this year, we are tightly coupling RPKI data and IRR data. And for the first time ever, we will have an industry-wide mechanism to signal that certain route objects are not valid. Today, if you find a route object in one of the IR databases, say Ccalm, you have and you disagree with the existence of that very route object, you have to reach out to NTT and ask them, beg them. You're like, hey guys, this is incorrect information. It may jeopardize my operations. Can you please remove the object? And this human back and forth, of course, doesn't scale, nor is there any protective layer that prevents the route object from reappearing at any point in time. Now, if we couple these RPKI ROAS and apply the origin validation procedure to route objects, not only can we decisively clean up a lot of legacy route objects that were created in the last 20 plus years, but it also provides a protective layer going forward where hijacks facilitated through fraudulent IRR route object registrations are simply not possible because the IRRD software will not accept the submitted route object. And this, I think, is a great selling point for RPKI, because even if we don't apply origin validation on the BGP layer, we can still use RPKI data to significantly clean up the IR databases that are out there.
But it should be done in parallel.
So in NTT's roadmap, a few months ago, we started treating RPKI ROAS as if they are route objects, where we communicate to our customers, you can choose, you can register an IR object or an RPKI ROA, or both. Our systems will pick up your routing intention and add them to the whitelist. This summer, I hope that we deploy the software, the new IRD version that ingests the RPKI data and applies that as a sanity filter. And then after that, we will deploy invalid is reject on the BGP edge. So it's a three-phase plan, and we are now close to executing phase 2.
Lovely. So, Mark, you heard that they have a three-phase plan, right? You created such a big news late last year saying April some date, Ccalm is going to drop invalids. How come you're so sure that it's going to not impact? Because the thing is, it's when we talk about in dropping the invalids, people say, "Oh, I'm going to lose some destinations," and yes, it's going to happen. So don't you think it's going to impact the operations, or you think the security, the routing security, is much important than the losing some destination, and they're going to fix it anyway? If they see the traffic is not coming towards their servers or their network, they're going to fix it anyway. What do you think? What made you, what forced you to do that announcement?
Yeah, so for us, it will be a take 2, actually. Unfortunately, I couldn't make the meeting at Cloudflare in San Francisco.
I didn't get the
'cause
invite, so it's okay if you didn't do this.
a government, I think, was closed over the holidays, so I couldn't make it. But yeah, so we actually Ccalm first, implemented RPKI back in 2014. It was a relatively young network then. We just revamped the entire thing, so there's not much legacy in the way of infrastructure, customer services, etc. So we had the liberty to do that. In 2013, 2014, we began to implement RPKI with, I think, what was called the RPKI toolkit at the time. I think a bit of software that was developed by Randy and Rob. And I think there was limited amount of support on equipment at the time. I think Cisco and Juniper had some support on various platforms. And we turned it on. All the RRRs at the time did have RPKI support, so we ingested the data into the relying party software, and it worked fundamentally as a protocol, but we discovered a number of issues with the implementations from particularly Cisco at the time. Number of ways of how they treated default application of policy against the RPKI data, and misinterpreting the RFCs, etc., etc. Anyway, between RPKI itself causing, connectivity issues for our customers, because we applied it across both peering, transit, and customer edge devices. Between that and the implementation issues in the router software, it was quite the learning experience. And unfortunately for us, what became real was that applying it on the edge meant that many of our customers were not receiving a bunch of routes from us that our competitors were handing over to them because they didn't do RPKI. And we discovered that more than 90% of the routes we were dropping as invalids were actually longer prefixes of the aggregate that had not been routed. So about 2015, 2016, we used that period, I think it's about a year, to communicate to the vendors about what worked, what didn't work, and then we turned it off because it literally did break connectivity, and it shifted traffic really to some of our competitors. Anyway, fast forward, 2018 now, there's been quite a lot of noise. It's great to see AT&T, NTT, Cloudflare, and the rest, turning this thing on, getting rowers agreeing to drop invalids, and that's really good. And that's something that, we believed at Ccalm would only work if we all did it together. Just me doing it, or just them doing it, or just some of us doing it doesn't move the needle. We all have to do it. And that's why, between Ccalm, Liquid, I don't know if Liquid made it to San Francisco, another one, the invite, did they?
No.
Liquid, ourselves, and Work Online. Yeah, Work Online. Yeah, Ben was there. So the three of us represent a reasonable portion of the African internet, and we've all, in principle, agreed April 1 to start to drop invalids. I'm not sure what level of progress Liquid and Work Online are at to get ready for that, but I'm sure they're making headway, and they should be ready. We still have the infrastructure in the network. We obviously just moved away from the RPKI toolkit and went over to the RIPE NCC validator, which works okay. It has a couple of issues, but nothing we can't fix. And we're ready for April 1. And I think, at least within the African context, if we are concerted across these three operators, I think we should be able to convince other service providers in the market to begin to consider getting rowers for their prefixes and turning on dropping of invalids.
So now, if I'm an operator, the problem is there are multiple relying party software. There are multiple validators available, right? And then there are problems in how quickly should I sync with the TAs, and and that trust with that. I mean, it is a trust anchor, but then the trust is if you're getting the updates on time, because it is going to impact your routing decision ultimately. So, as a network operator, are we ready to make some BCPs around it, or it's too early? We have to still wait and watch and see how it's gonna go, and then you make the decisions, or you think the protocol is ready? It's just the implementations are not ready. The route validators are probably, as you said, they were the RPK validator from the RIPE NCC. There were issues, but you can fix it. But we can fix it. It's gonna take some time. Is it the message to the operators that no, it's not ready? Still rely on the IRD.
No, so definitely we speak of our own experience. I think the AT&T deployment also is their own experience, and I'm sure Cloudflare and Entity are gathering data about some of the feedback they're getting from the implementation in the system, and I believe a number of us have to, begin the implementation and then coalesce around what we think BCPs are. In relation to how often we store data, query the data, how we scale the RTR, how we do all of those things, and I don't think those answers are going to come now, but we have to find them, which means we have to start getting stuff done, and we have to accept that at some point we might break a few things.
Yes. At least more versions of the route validators are coming in. So, Martin, before you answer this one, I want to add another question to that. You mentioned one thing, that there was one point which was discussed, is the 24/7 operations. Well, that's network operators is not new, but it is absolutely new for RIRs.
Right. So so the 24/7 and RIRs, very big subject, and actually even shows that operators have to think a little bit more carefully about how to operate in an RPKI world. But just take a rewind on this. So in a way to toot our own horn, but I'm holding the microphone so I can get away with it. So Cloudflare released their validator, and we blogged about it in the last week, written in Go, actually, if you care, comes as a Docker image if you need to do that. Otherwise, go to GitHub. It's a different piece of software than what the RIPE validator, which is how we started, by the way. I mean, that's both the V2 version and now the V3 version. It is good, and I said this earlier, and I'm going to repeat it, it is good to have multiple platforms. There is stuff coming out of NL Labs as well. And by the way, those three all written in different languages, which means that they're based upon different underlying crypto libraries. They're based on underlying mechanisms of deployment. And all of those things go to get both experience, diverse experience, and also to double check the protocols just to make things really work. When you write, if you're the author of an RFC and then you also write the proving code for that, which by the way is good, that's great. But until somebody sits in a room with a piece of paper, the spec, and writes something to that spec and says, all right, let me plug in an Ethernet cable, see if I can actually talk to somebody else with the spec. That's what we did in the 80s, by the way. I mean, that was actually how we convinced that stuff would work. But to go back and talk about the last part that Mark mentioned, operators will get experience with whether using rsync in an aggressive manner against an RIR to get hold of the data is the right thing, or whether that we go and use better protocols, ones that, and I'm biased in this sense, that can be put behind content delivery networks so that we can get scale. Because rsync doesn't have that scalability, except for, you pointed out last week that the BSD releases are rsynced at an insanely high rate. Every day, every week, every whatever. So we know it can be done. So now we get onto that 24/7 and RIR issue. Who said that? Somebody said that. No. whoa, sorry. I am not a fan of rsync. Sorry, that. Sorry, this was. I went off on and I didn't hit that.
So, RR,
Yeah.
RRDP? So
You're
you want-
100% correct.
You wanted to say RRDP?
I wanted to say that, but that was not my point. My point was that operators will either refuse to use it because of their internal security people saying this is not acceptable, or they won't use it because operationally it's not usable. We have an alternate protocol which is much better. Sorry, it's better, is usable. I really think we are heading down a plan. Well, okay. Okay, so let me rewind and talk about 24/7, and then this comes back up in. Right. So, networks, content delivery networks, access networks, internet exchanges all operate 24/7. And when you bring a new element into the play, you really want to understand what its dependencies are and whether you can deal with it at 3 o'clock in the morning or when somebody's on vacation, or the one person that sets something up. So it turns out that in the big picture of of RPKI and who's involved in multiple RIRs and transferring data and processing code and relying on certificates that may expire, you actually notice that there's an awful lot of things where you're dependent on somebody else. So you've lost a little bit of your own autonomy. What you've gained is this ability to say, okay, I at least have information that's cryptographically signed, so therefore I have a programmatic way of knowing whether it's good or bad, etc. And when you write code and when you build operations, the thing you have to spend the most amount of time on is if something goes wrong, what do I do? Do I revert to yesterday's data? Do I generate a file of length 0 and then suddenly have no filtering? These are all the things that as an operator and a software developer and the like, you have to look at. And so in last week's discussion, this came down to one interesting point was if we're reliant on pulling data quite regularly from RIRs, and behind that there is a cryptographic engine that is signing new elements and delivering stuff, and there may be HSMs involved as part of that process, is that in fact capable of running at a 24/7, 365, and can I pick up the phone or open a ticket on a 3 a.m. Sunday morning, time zone adjusted for whatever that statement means? And to be honest, the answer was no, not exactly. And you got to remember that an RIR is a membership-based organization. Whether it be APNIC or ARIN or RIPE or LACNIC, AFRINIC, it is up to the members to say what they want. And it was a very clear message from there saying, if you want 24/7 support, then go talk to your RIRs as members and specify what you want. Maybe you end up having to pay the price for that. And that was left as an exercise that still has to be done. And as more operators get involved, we will end up with smarter people who can go to the microphones at RIR meetings or put proposals in and actually start working on this. So that part got its day at the microphone. And we as operators and the RIRs in the room and anybody else now have to take that and run with it in some way and work out what that actually means. The meeting was not about solving something by 6 p.m. or 4 p.m.
Just at least highlighting it, right?
Absolutely.
At least highlighting it. I mean, just adding another question to that. Entity has resources in many places, right?
Sorry?
Entity has resources in many multiple RIRs?
Yes.
Right. So you are heavily relied on RIR database. RIR, functioning of RIR, not their database, right? Because they are giving you ROAS. And so how you going to rely on an RIR which is not even 24/7 if they are not available? If you're facing a problem, you cannot call anyone.
We have to consider the option where indeed the RER may have different failure modes, and explore how we treat those failure modes, preferably in an automated way. For instance, if you cannot fetch data, do you then ignore the expiration dates of certificates, or do you not, or do you go still? Do you empty the database and go insecure? These are fantastic questions, and I don't have a good answer for you right now, because I think we as operators must collectively, through trial and error, just walk through the fire and see what mechanisms work best. There are some lessons we can learn from IRR databases. For instance, the Cephas database on one day just disappeared. And I emailed them and say, hey, mirroring is not working. We're operating on an old copy. Can you enable your service again? And they said, no, the server died and we have no intentions of restoring the service. It's like, oh, that's interesting, because you ceased to operate, and now my customers may have dependencies on data that previously was in your database, but you're no longer taking responsibility for that. And I had to untangle the spaghetti and figure out which AS sets were still in use, which were not, what things are referenced, what is still visible in the BGP tables, do an intersection, and now we have a mechanism to phase out IRR databases, but that only came up when we first experienced this. So yeah, we have to do some trial and error. I'd like to respond to something you mentioned earlier, where you said that there was a commercial impact to operating with a invalid is reject policy, because you'd have less routes than your competitors. And this is a very valid concern. Management, of course, will say, okay, I believe all of these benefits, but what is the impact on our data, because we earn money per bit. And I have good news that was announced at the roundtable. PMACCT, a famous open source traffic analyzer engine, has been extended with support for origin validation. And this means that the PMACCT software that can ingest S-flow, NetFlow, and IPFix data, correlate that with live BGP feeds to figure out what data comes in on what port and where it leaves, and whether you're generating revenue on the traffic or not, can now also ingest RPKI data. And the cool thing is that it allows you to run projections on your network, what will happen if you drop invalid announcements. Previously, AT&T had to do it the hard way. They took a snapshot of their traffic profile, dropped invalids, and then took another snapshot, and they compared them with each other, and they discovered they lost virtually no traffic. It was statistical noise. Now, that's, of course, a very daring approach to deploy first and then measure. The PMACCT tool, which I recommend all of you install, allows you to see exactly how much traffic will disappear, and you don't need to adjust your network. All the logic is in the engine itself, so you don't touch your network at all. You don't need to fiddle with your policies. There's absolutely no changes whatsoever. PMACCT will still be able to tell you exactly this is what's going to happen. Because the software does a cute little trick. When we talk about RPKI invalids, and there's roughly 5,000 of them at the moment, these 5,000 exist in such a steady state that we can now consider them misconfigurations. These are ROAs that were perhaps set up in the last 6 years. The employee leaves the company, it was not handed over, the company changes its routing policy at some point later, and the ROAs are never updated. And because there were so few networks doing origin validation, this had no measurable impact to anybody's operations. Whether the ROA existed or not, did not exist, there was no measurable difference. But as more and more networks are deploying origin validation, these are having some effect. What the PMACCT software can do is it can differentiate between this is an invalid route for which no alternative path exists that, for instance, is a less specific that is either valid or unknown, or this announcement and the traffic flowing towards it is covered by a less specific and therefore you will still have a path to that set of IP addresses. And having the capability to differentiate between those two allows me to specify in reports up to management, up to the megabit, how much revenue is impacted. And for NTT at least, the good news is the revenue impact would be statistically insignificant. We're talking about less than 0.0000% of our traffic that would no longer be routable. And even if it's just a handful of bits, I think there will be a positive feedback loop where people are encouraged to correct their ROAS or delete their ROAS as more and more networks deploy origin validation. So my message here is you can measure impact, what will happen. That's cool news. The 5,000 invalids, 5,000 sounds like a high number, but in terms of traffic, it means nothing, at least for us. So it allows us to make different or more informed decisions. And in other words, deploying origin validation is commercially viable. And the upsides of not accepting hijacks, of course, have a cost benefit as well.
Just hit one more point. So, if I ask you to hold up your hand if you're running a network, in theory, nearly everybody in this room should lift their hand. The internet routing tables are global in nature, in the sense that we announce a route, whether it be from a customer in Africa or a content delivery network somewhere or a core backbone somewhere, and they propagate globally. That's the goal. We want to communicate globally. The routing table looks different on each one of our routers because we have a different point of view into how the world is interconnected, whether we're at an internet peering point or whether we are or whether we're a stub network, et cetera, et cetera. But these invalids or future invalids or anything that we drop, in fact, turn out to be quite a common process. So what's interesting is that when we see an invalid due to fat fingering or a hiccup or historical reasons, it doesn't matter which one of us picks up the phone and phones that person far, far away, or virtual phones them and emails them or whatever, and says, you have an invalid RPKI ROA and you should update it because it doesn't match your present routing policy. And it turns out that it's solved for each and every one of us, not only in the room, but 60,000 odd ASs that are live on the global routing table. This point has been sitting in my brain ever since sort of last week or so, because some of the operators there talked, Telia actually talked about, you know, like contacting customers and getting them to fix things. That doesn't really scale. But what's interesting is that it doesn't matter which one of us picks up the phone. It fixes it for all of us. And what's been sitting in the back of my mind for a week and will take a while before I sort of come up with a good way of doing this is we actually need to work out who and where and what mechanism we're going to use, because you can't just leave an invalid, shouldn't leave an invalid in the RPKI data sets. You, in fact, should go work on fixing it. And yeah, 5,000 actually turns out, sounds worse than it is, but as we change sort of the numbers on, I really like this, by the way, as we change the numbers on this and we get to sort of closer to, well, even magic things happen when you go above 50% with systems like this, but when you get to 100%, you realize that, in fact, actually, we really do want to be fixing stuff and finding out who it is and dealing with, again, an operational issue that if a network far, far away has made done something quite incorrect with setting up ROAs, and it is affecting traffic, whether it be through backbones or content delivery networks, or try this one, a decision to use a route or to allow connections from a route, even if there's a default around, and judge it differently. So let's try something hypothetical. You're sitting at home, you're sitting in the office, and you access a website and it gives you that information, and you continue as if whatever. The next day, due to a misconfiguration by your networking group, you're sitting in the office or sitting at home or an internet cafe, and you access a website, but you're accessing it from a route that is marked invalid, that the RPKI information is wrong. And now you get sent a captcha because that site, that IP address, that block isn't valid. You can still access, so the absolute cutting off has not happened, but now your access to content on that has changed dramatically. Because is it as trusted a network? Maybe that's a hijacked block. Maybe it's whatever. But you want to be able to correct issues like that fairly quickly. It all comes back to, yeah, we're going to end up in the BCP world with this. We're going to end up with things that touch multiple entities. So think about, you know, the subtlety of what we need to work as we get further down this road of more and more signed routes and more validating routers.
Okay, so Mark, just wrapping up question is, yeah, we need to start drinking. So we have, it's not network operators talking to network operators, right? We don't need end user at the moment to discuss things. We have to deal with the operational issues. Is it important to have these kind of roundtable in every region? Or it's just like we discuss it every now and then, discuss it on Nanox sometimes, discuss it in RIPE meetings and Apricot sometimes once in a year, and that should be enough? Or it should be a close group of people who decide what's the best and then come up with the idea, well, let's start doing this. What do you recommend?
No, I think every region, if you take RAR as a region, needs to have a group of people that understand the technology, can come together, deal with the intricacies of their environments, and then obviously meet at a much global level. You know, we already have customers today that struggle trying to understand IRR, never mind RPKI. And that's not only in the African region, that's everywhere. So yeah, I think every region requires a set of champions. I think North America have theirs, RIPE seems to have theirs. We have a bunch of people up in the Afrinic region, LACNIC have theirs, but you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
it's all of us. We can't expect one person just to fix this. And you know, a lot of people aren't interested in it. We sort of have to have those people that are to sort of herd the rest of us that aren't into this slide, because ultimately it's going to happen. And when people like, you know, like Cloudflare, Google, etc., decide to use this, I mean, if you take Martin's extreme of having a capture on a website, yeah, that's going to quickly encourage people to do the right thing. Yeah. So yeah, it's across the board, definitely.
Cool. Okay. I think we are out of time, way out of time. So thank you so much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
If you have any question, just 1-2 minutes question, just can we give, or yeah, just ask. Tashi, you can yell and scream. Exactly. This is the idea for this discussion is to form a sort of a working group or something in region where we can discuss the operational issue. This command is not working. What should I do? Ask those who have done it. I mean, there are some bigger platform, Nanog and other mailing lists. People usually don't post, and there are cultural issues. There are people don't share that much information in some part of the region. Some people are not very comfortable asking those questions. So what do you think is creating a smaller group, or a smaller group on a global level would work, or a smaller group on region would work?
Join an IRC channel. It's called #IX on the IRC server, irc.terahertz.net. It's English speaking, and there are 400 fellow operators, and there's bound to be one that can help you in one way or another.
It's my job. I will share that IRC information now. Great. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, everyone.
And sorry, just one announcement.
Yes.
So tomorrow we have the RPKI
yes.
BOF. It's actually a whiskey BOF. The deal is if you can show that you have a signed ROA, either in the past or up until tomorrow before the BOF, you get in, you get a T-shirt, whiskey, some music, and some food.
And a USB from ISOC.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.